Welcome to the 2021 Florida Historical Society Virtual Annual Meeting and Symposium. I'm Ben Brotemarkle, Executive Director of the Florida Historical Society, and the name of this session is Difficult History, Preserving the Past, and Protecting the Future. And if there's one common thread that is linking all of the diverse topics in this presentation, it's the panelists themselves, who are all young, up-and-coming scholars who are doing important work in Florida history and culture. We're going to be hearing from Myles Sullivan, whose presentation is called Amateur Minstrel Shows and Blackface Amusements at the University of Florida in the Jim Crow Era. Welcome, Myles.
Thank you for having me.
And we'll also be hearing from Holly Baker, whose topic is Documenting Diversity, Collecting Folk Songs in Depression-Era Florida. Welcome, Holly.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Also here is Levi Watson, whose topic is Florida's Vanishing Heritage, Climate Adaptation at Florida Heritage Sites. Welcome, Levi.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
And we'll start with Myles Sullivan. Myles Sullivan is a PhD student in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Florida. His primary research field is historical archaeology, and he's worked on excavations for historic sites like James Madison's Montpelier and Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia. He's currently completing a master's thesis that combines archaeological and historical materials to examine life in St. Augustine during the British period. His research attempts to understand the complexities of colonialism, identity, and consumption through material culture in the late 18th century. In addition to his academic work, he enjoys playing old-time fiddle and jazz guitar, which sparked his initial interest in learning more about the social history behind the minstrel shows that occurred at the University of Florida in the 1910s. So Myles, please tell us about your research into amateur minstrel shows and blackface amusements at the University of Florida in the Jim Crow era.
Yes, so when I practice this a few times, I get bogged down in the details. So I'm going to try to keep it moving in terms of focusing on the shows that happened at UF. But the topic of minstrelsy and blackface minstrelsy is very complicated, and there's been a lot of research done on it. But one of the things that stood out to me when I first came across these shows, which appear in, actually they were recently digitized as of 2019, but the student newspaper at University of Florida did a full digitization of the newspaper, and just searching for topics for a seminar class on Jim Crow America, I stumbled across these shows in the 1910s. And when I started looking more into the history of minstrelsy in America, you get a different picture of the antebellum minstrel shows with what's occurring at UF. One, because of that amateur nature of the shows. These are sort of local shows that were spurred on by students and faculty at the UF and put on for, initially for Gainesville, those people of Gainesville, as a way to display student talent. And at the same time, it was a fundraiser. And this is very different from, at this point, a lot of professional minstrel shows were going bankrupt after their initial popularity in the 19th century. There's a few sort of stragglers left in the 1910s, but a lot of sort of the research focus of minstrelsy by the 1910s, you're looking at Birth of a Nation in cinema, and these other sort of new novel forms of entertainment that are coming out. But at the same time, across America, there seems to be a lot of, organizations and clubs and schools, churches were putting on amateur blackface minstrel shows. And it's just us, why were these organizations a lot of times exclusively for, white individuals? Why were they all putting on these sort of racialized performances where, racial caricatures of African-American, music, song, dance, and even speech. And initially the fundraiser, and I guess the last thing that I wanted is we're still seeing this today in terms of minstrel blackface in academic settings, even at UF, there's cases up through the 60s and 70s. There was fraternities putting on benefit shows. And then yesterday, my roommate was telling me about, a person in Oregon protesting a vaccine mandate by showing up to school dressed as Rosa Parks in blackface. So this is something that keeps getting sort of reiterated in society, and sort of has in some ways sort of been positioned within academic settings more so than sort of popular culture in the theater in some ways, though that's still prevalent as well. And so initially the fundraiser was for to build bleacher seating for a football stadium in the baseball field at the time. So that's another sort of linkage, like the first seats at a stadium that today can seat 80,000 people was coming through this sort of racialized entertainment, which is sort of strange to think about these kind of linkages between this kind of entertainment as a way to fundraise that has, started with these early practices of blackface. And so looking through sort of documents, which includes the yearbooks, the primary sort of focus was the student newspaper, the Florida Alligator, and then also oral histories that were collected from students. And most of these were done by Samuel Proctor in the 1970s and 60s, and sort of getting at what people were saying, writing, and talking about, and how they remembered these shows, to get an idea of, one, what exactly was happening on these stages, and then so what were the impacts of local performances of these blackface caricatures in Gainesville and in northern Florida. And one thing to note is that this was really that sort of aspect of community engagement, because University of Florida had recently arrived to Gainesville with following the Buckman Act in 1906. And so this is the first shows in 1914 were only 8 years after that. And so this was a sort of a way of engaging with that, with the town. And there had been precedents actually in Gainesville itself. The East Florida Seminary had put on a minstrel show in the 1900s, as well as sort of a local society as a fundraiser as well. And in terms of, for students interested in music, this was one of the main ways that they could do that. And it was described as practically the only student dramatic attempt at University of Florida. So this was really a primary focus for people interested in theater and music and acting. This was pretty much about the only opportunity that they had outside of forming their own bands and dance bands and stuff like that, which actually happened. People played in the minstrel shows and then would form bands and play, jazz music for dances and stuff. And the other thing is the shows themselves incorporated, it wasn't, everybody wasn't in blackface. There was the N men who were in blackface. And actually two of these people were locals from Gainesville. And one, J. Fletcher Burnett, was actually, in 1920, he was the president of the Rotary Club. So these are well-known people in town and well-respected socially. And again, this was an opportunity for students to meet locals and work with them and then put on this show. And then also when they started doing tours across the state. So they went to Ocala, they went to Tampa, they went to Jacksonville, Orlando. And in total, there was, between 1914 and 1920, there were 33 shows that were sort of under this name, the Greater Florida Minstrels, of students. The key thing here is that, not everybody was in blackface. And so that there was these serious sort of ballad singers, they had like the gymnastics team would do a performance, but interspersed with ballads were these N men who would insert jokes, sing, sort of blues songs, and a style of minstrelsy that was popular at that time under the name of coon songs. They would perform these songs, and that's how they were described in the newspaper, and sort of known, like the caricatures that were often used were, they were thieves that would steal chickens, and were lazy and would have a razor that they could slash people with and be violent. And so we're getting these two images of these comic scenes of blackface and these more violent scenes interspersed between sort of maybe regular pop songs that we're performing. And so in terms of the music itself, which I initially was interested in looking at specifically because of my interest in sort of folk music and in general, was what they were playing. And what you see is actually they're playing songs that were published by Tin Pan Alley publishers, not a year or 2 years earlier. These are new songs that are being performed, and that's a selling point of the show. People don't want to see songs that are 50 or 60 years old, or maybe not even 10 years old. They're being billed as up to date, snappy tunes. And these are songs that are popular nationwide from some of the people that have looked at sort of aggregates of popular music at that time. A lot of these were high selling sheet music sales in sheet music sales. But nonetheless, in terms of the racial imagery, sort of one scene stands out in 1920 from a show in Jacksonville, is they're still nonetheless billed as old time, like the old time minstrel shows, how it's described. And they're even in this 1920 show, for example, they're employing ideas of what Dixie is. And so they start the show and it's described as a, old time show, is a song that was called Dixie is Dixie Once More, that was celebrating the end of World War I and the return of soldiers from World War I. And it's got, that mentions the Swanee Shore, so the Swanee River in Florida, but it's written by a person from New York. And it's sort of, celebrating the work of, student veterans who are coming back and painting them in context to the old South, the antebellum South, that was sort of being put up in this nostalgic tradition at this time. And then at the end of the show, they also had do another recently released song called Who Discovered Dixie, that again is drawing on these sort of old South notions of, the old plantation homes. And then they're putting on what they described as a plantation jubilee, where they actually draw on some of those older minstrel songs in addition to this newer song as sort of the big finale. And so in this instance, right after World War I, at the time when, there's a lot, an increased agitation by Black Floridians for their civil rights, is we're seeing this sort of melding of the old South and the new South on stage in this really locally enacted performance that is sort of mustered together by a local community and put on for a local community. And sort of in terms of how that connects to the rest of the Jim Crow Florida at that time, is this idea of humor and entertainment, and that sort of blackface, as it's locally enacted, is a object of entertainment and humor. And then we're also seeing that in much more explicitly violent actions, like the lynchings in Florida, which were at an all-time high in the state, and this idea of spectacle lynchings, where this becomes a performance. And in a similar avenue that we're having these blackface entertainments on stage, is that this performance element that's generated from a community level is also occurring in these sort of popular acts of justice in Newberry, Rosewood, and with the 1920 Election Day riots in Okia. So in terms of blackface, I think that can get lost when we're talking about it as like a popular culture, popular entertainment, and that there's these real connections to these other acts. And there's one instance that I just want to end on in the Florida Alligator that kind of highlights this kind of ownership of racial violence as entertainment. And it comes from, basically, it was a camping trip by students in 1919. And what they describe it in the newspaper, and it says, on Saturday afternoon, March 8th, 8 hardy adventurers braved the unpromising weather conditions and set out for Warren's Cave. After breakfast the following morning, target practice was indulged in, and also a mock lynching party conducted with the assistance of unwilling subjects in the shape of 2 dusky boys. The adventurers departed from the cave about 9:30, and in spite of a number of vigorous showers, arrived at the university in plenty of time for Sunday dinner. And so this is just encapsulating this almost casual nature as entertainment, in between the taking ownership of these 2 children and bringing them into this avenue of entertainment, and as as a spectacle and as something that they had every right to do. And it just sort of underscores, perpetuating, both white supremacy, race relations, and reinforcing that, and not in sort of a legislative way, but just in a locally, person to person way, that this wasn't just about laws and legislation, but this was how you treat other people through interacting.
Well, I appreciate that. That is a very difficult history that you're talking about. And I'm just wondering, of course, today you mentioned that there are some instances of blackface in culture today, but they're almost universally, panned. It's and we don't see minstrel shows today, of course. But I'm just wondering, as you were going through these articles, was there any resistance at all? Did you see to the minstrel shows at the time, or was this just a celebratory fun thing?
Yeah, so there were the instances in the 1910s where there was resistance, was when they weren't sure that they were going to be able to, during 1918, with they weren't sure they had the students capable of putting on a good show, and they were worried that they were going to look bad in front of their audiences if they weren't going to put on an entertaining show. And in terms of resistance to minstrelsy and blackface, you don't see it in the instances I saw it till 1960s, the end of the 1960s. And there was sort of a contention between one of the students in the marching band took a uniform and dressed up in blackface, I think for a Halloween party, and then he got either banned for the semester. But that's when there was sort of a dialogue on, is this the right thing to do? We shouldn't be doing this. And before that, it really was, there wasn't resistance to it. There was resistance to lynching. There was calls to stop lynching in the news, in the Florida Alligator, by sort of a collection of faculty across Southern universities. And so that was in the mix, but not specifically to minstrelsy.
Interesting. Well, before we move on, Holly and Levi, do you have any questions for Myles about his work?
Yes, I actually am curious about the history of minstrelsy. Is that what you would call it?
Yeah.
The history of it. When did it become a thing? Has it been a long time that people have been using blackface? Is it something that's been around for hundreds of years, or is it something that just started happening within the past 100 years or so?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's elements of it predating, but in terms, like, in the 1700s, there was examples of it on stage, and earlier than that, but in terms of the minstrel show, that's been linked to 1843 with Christie's Virginia Minstrels, and that set up it as its own thing. People were doing blackface in between acts of theater productions as sort of like one-offs, but with the Virginia Christie's Minstrels, and that's kind of, that honed in on the banjo, fiddle, and the percussionist as the end men in this kind of comedic theatrical performance is when that kicks off. That's to be more specific. So it's seen as like one of the earliest sort of American popular phenomenon in its own way.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
I just have a quick question. In your research, did you see any other mentions of like the use of blackface in cultures outside of the United States, or was this kind of an exclusive thing to the United States?
So there's actually, I was pretty keyed in on to what was happening to the United States. But in doing that, you know, this was big in Britain in the 1800s. And actually, one of the articles I came across was in Australia, that after a minstrel show came through, they were putting on amateur minstrel shows there in the 1840s through the 1890s. So I didn't look much beyond maybe sort of English speaking world, but in those instances, it's coming up there.
Thank you.
Interesting. Well, if anybody who is watching this has a question for Myles, you can email us at membership@myfloridahistory.org, and we'll get the question to Myles, and he can answer it for you. Next up is Holly Baker, who is archivist at the Library of Florida History, where I am right now in Cocoa. And she's also public history coordinator for the Florida Historical Society. She's also a podcast producer with the history department at the University of Central Florida. In addition to regularly producing segments for Florida Frontiers, the weekly radio magazine of the Florida Historical Society, Holly makes podcasts for the Florida Historical Quarterly and the Knights History Cast, which is the podcast of the UCF History Department. Holly has a master's degree in public history from the University of Central Florida, and her topic today is documenting diversity, collecting folk songs in Depression-era Florida. So Holly, please tell us about your topic.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to take part in this. I love to talk about the Federal Writers Project because it's something that, it's a topic that I don't think a lot of folks have really delved into. First of all, what was the Federal Writers Project? It was created in 1935 by President Franklin D. Roosevelt as part of the Works Progress Administration to provide employment opportunities for historians, teachers, writers, librarians, and other white-collar workers during a time of economic downturn during the Great Depression. And the purpose of the Federal Writers Project was primarily to produce guidebooks for each state under the name the American Guide Series. And those books focused on the scenery, the history, and different cultural aspects of the United States. I've always been, particularly as a native Floridian, interested in what the Federal Writers Project did in Florida. So first of all, the Federal Writers Project in Florida was headed by Dr. Corita Doggett Course. She was the director of the Federal Writers Project in Florida from 1935 to 1942. And she also created what was called the Negro Writers Unit that focused on Black history and culture. The Negro Writers Unit was instrumental in capturing songs, stories, and ex-slave narratives that can still be found today. So I would like to talk about some of the folklorists who were involved with the Federal Writers Project in Florida. First of all, let's talk about Zora Neale Hurston. She's one of my favorite people to talk about. I go to the Zora Neale Hurston Festival of the Arts and Humanities in Eatonville every year. And in 1935, first of all, she was an anthropologist and an author. If you're not sure who Zora Neale Hurston is, known for her best-selling book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. Many of her books focused on Florida as a setting, and she was just proud to be from Eatonville, Florida. Her father, John, used to be the mayor of Eatonville at one point. So anyway, in 1935, anthropologist and author Zora Neale Hurston, she began working as an interviewer and a folklorist with the Federal Writers Project in Florida. And but on her first job with the Federal Writers Project, she traveled with folklorist Alan Lomax and New York University professor Mary Elizabeth Barnacle to do some research on African American song traditions. And she wanted to see what their relationship was to slave songs. And so Alan Lomax was collecting folk songs for the Library of Congress at the time, and he was a leading expert in Black Southern folk music and culture. So they made a really good team. Zora Neale Hurston was invited by Alan Lomax to help make contacts and to find new material because he wasn't from Florida, but she was, and she knew where to go to find the songs. So in 1938 and 1939, a couple years later, after collecting with Alan Lomax and Miss Barnacle, Zora Neale Hurston again returned to Florida to collect folk songs and slave narratives. So she was officially hired at that time by the Florida division of the Federal Writers Project. She did field work for the Negro unit, and she scouted out recording locations such as turpentine camps, churches, juke joints, all across Florida. And I noticed that a lot of the songs she recorded were railroad songs. She was particularly interested in railroad songs. They were also called spiking songs because they were sung in a rhythm to keep the hammer crew coordinated as they drove railroad spikes into the tracks. So those are interesting songs to hear. So between 1935 and 1939, Zora Neale Hurston collected, I'd say, a couple hundred songs in Belglade, Chosin, Eatonville, Jacksonville, and Cross City. So just listening to those songs just recorded by Zora Neale Hurston is amazing. I came across, when I was doing research on this topic, a letter that she wrote actually in our archive at the Library of Florida History. I came across the proposed recording expedition into the Floridas. It's a letter that Zora Neale Hurston wrote in 1939 to Henry Alsberg and Ben Botkin of the Federal Writers Project. And the letter's purpose was to encourage them to keep recording folk songs in Florida, because she wrote, there is no state in the Union with as much to record in a musical, folklore, and social ethnic way as Florida has. Nowhere else is there such a variety of materials. Florida is still a frontier with its varying elements still unassimilated. There is still an opportunity to observe the wombs of folk culture still heavy with life. She was thinking that this was a great opportunity to get to understand the people of Florida, and but unfortunately the Federal Writers Project ended a couple years later in 1942, but I'll talk more about that in a moment. I want to continue talking about other people who were part of the expeditions, that I like to call them, the folk collecting expeditions. Another important person with the Federal Writers Project was Stetson Kennedy. So from 1937 to 1942, Floridian activist, writer, and folklorist Stetson Kennedy headed the unit on folklore, oral history, and social ethnic studies. He collected folk songs in Ybor City, Cuban songs, Bahamian songs in Key West, conch songs in Riviera. He also went to Cross City with Zora Neale Hurston to document turpentine camp songs and traditional songs in Jacksonville at the Clara White Mission, which was a soup kitchen. And in his essay called A Florida Treasure Hunt, Kennedy recalled of the expeditions in Florida, quote, "None of us had ever gone hunting for folk songs before, but we were soon able to recognize one the moment we heard it, and to realize it was truly a bit of cultural treasure that we were discovering and preserving for future generations to enjoy." So he really appreciated his work collecting folk songs for the Federal Writers Project. And in his book, Palmetto Country, he talks about that and his experiences of doing that. Another folklorist involved with the Federal Writers Project at that time was Alton Morris. He was a fourth generation Floridian from the Lake Okeechobee region. And he began working as a field worker for the Federal Writers Project in the mid-30s. For the Federal Writers Project, he collected Minorcan songs in St. Augustine, which I was really intrigued by, because with Minorcan history, you read a lot about, you know, recipes and things like that, but not maybe their songs as much. So there's a song called Fromagardis that's about this Easter tradition of, singing for cakes, drinking wine, and this song is beautifully sung, and just a interesting song that lets you understand more about Minorcan folk music. And he also, Alton Morris, recorded Slavic songs in Town and Slavia, Florida. And he collected Greek songs with Dr. Corita Doggett Course in Jacksonville, and with Stetson Kennedy in Tarpon Springs. And he used his fieldwork with the Federal Writers Project as inspiration for his dissertation on Florida folk songs that he wrote at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. In 1950, his dissertation was published as a book called Folk Songs of Florida. And it's one of the only collections of Florida folk songs that I could find when I was doing research. It was like the holy grail of folk songs when I came across his book. And it's actually, that book is hard to come by itself, but Alton Morris became a professor of English at the University of Florida, and he was also the founder and editor of Southern Folklife Quarterly. And in the early 1950s, Alton Morris convinced the Florida Women's Music Club to hold an annual Florida Folk Festival, and it still goes on each year, and I try to attend each year. It takes place in White Springs near Gainesville. So that's one of his legacies, and it all began with the Federal Writers Project. Another important player in the Federal Writers Project in Florida was Alan Lomax, one of the few that wasn't actually a Floridian, but he was a folklorist and an ethnographer who collected and archived American folk songs and music, thanks probably to his dad, John Lomax, who discovered Leadbelly. He was a big ethnographer as well, but his father, John Lomax, worked at the Library of Congress, of course, and he was the head of the archive of the American folk song that was established in 1928. And so when John Lomax got that position, he enlisted his son, Alan, to help collect recordings, music recordings. And so then Alan became the assistant in charge at the archives at the Library of Congress in 1937. And so he made field trips in Florida and actually all around other states as well, and created recordings for the Library of Congress until 1942. And so even though he didn't officially work as a folklorist with the Federal Writers Project, he collaborated with the project, and he made important contributions in preserving American folk music. And a lot of people say he was responsible for the folk revival that happened in the 50s and 60s as well. So he recorded with Zora Neale Hurston and Elizabeth Barnacle in Eatonville, Chosin, and Belle Glade. And he was a great recorder because when you listen to his recordings, he's always asking beforehand, where did you hear this song? Who taught you this song? And that is a great resource for anybody who's trying to understand where these songs came from, because these people are saying what their name was, where they're from, who taught them the song, what the song's about. And there's hundreds of these songs. So I appreciate Alan Lomax and his ability to interview people well. And Zora Neale Hurston was very good at that as well. And of course, she traveled with him, and they were good with each other, and they were just good at listening and learning about the interviewee. Another person was Carita Dogger-Course, the director of the Federal Writers Project, but she was also one of the folks out and doing field work collecting the songs. In 1940, Dr. Course and a gentleman named Robert Cornwall recorded Seminole songs at the Brighton Reservation in South Florida. They recorded John Josh, Naha Tiger, Barfield Johns, Robert Osceola, and Billy Bowleg singing traditional Seminole songs such as Horned Owl, Snake Dance, Green Corn Dance at the Brighton Reservation. So those songs are very important to listen to as well. There weren't as many Seminole songs as maybe other songs that were recorded during that time. But it's amazing that they even gave the Federal Writers Project the permission to record these songs. So Dr. Course and Robert Cornwall also went to a town called Sebring, Florida, where they recorded what they called cracker songs, and there were fiddle tunes, a lot of good, country bluegrass sounding songs that came out of Sebring, Florida on that same trip. So those were just some of the folklorists. There's a couple others. There was a gentleman named John Philliton. I have a hard time finding information about him. He's very mysterious, but he also recorded some songs as well, some Greek songs here and there. There was a photographer named Robert Cook who also accompanied on these trips, took photos, and a lot of those photos were destroyed, which breaks my heart. But it would be really great to have some photos of these trips. But there are some, but not as many as there should be. So I have been intrigued by the recorder that they carried with them all over to record these folk songs. So I've long been intrigued imagining them lugging around a coffee table sized recorder all over Florida. And because that's how Stetson Kennedy described it. Stetson Kennedy described it as a coffee table sized recorder. I have to admit, it's not really that big. It's quite large, but not as large as I imagined it. But yeah, it was called a it was on loan, first of all, from the Library of Congress, and they had several of them. It was called a Presto Instant Disc Recorder. And there were several models that they were loaning out at any given time because there were field workers working all over the country recording these songs. So that's something else I'm interested in. Which exact recorder did they use? I don't know. There were 4 models, D, K, E, and Y. So I'm currently still trying to figure that out. And I would love to get one for the Library of Florida History, just because to be able to look and see what they were dealing with when they were carrying things out to turpentine camps to record, and then taking the recordings and mailing them back to DC. The disc consisted of an aluminum plate that was coated with cellulose nitrate lacquer. It wasn't acetate. So, but just the fact that they still exist, and some of them aren't the greatest quality, but the fact that they still exist is amazing to me. So now I want to talk about the legacy of the folk song collecting expeditions. It seems like that lately the legacy of the Federal Writers Project has been examined in a new light because of the availability of the songs that were recorded. People thought of the Federal Writers Project primarily about the guidebooks that they made, but there were these recordings as well. And but anyway, I want to say that in 1935, folklorist Alan Lomax wrote a letter to the WPA insisting that the folk songs that they collected, quote, should not be buried in libraries as they are in Washington and in universities all over the country. He wanted the public to be able to hear the music and to keep the music alive for future generations. But when the Federal Writers Project ended in 1942, the songs did stay buried for several decades until the Library of Congress had the technology to digitize and preserve the songs. Then they made a digital archive to house the recordings, and that changed everything. So the focus didn't have to be on the written word anymore. It could be on the sound recordings that were created as well. So today you can find the Federal Writers Project's American Guidebook series books, including the one written about Florida called Florida, A Guide to the Southernmost State, written in 1939. But in the book, there's only a few sentences about the folk music, which is amazing to me because they recorded hundreds of them all over every state with this big recorder, and a lot of effort went into that. Transcribing songs, talking to people, getting to learn about them. So I think now is a chance for people to go to Library of Congress website, loc.gov, go to the Florida Folk Life from the WPA collections, 1937 to 1942, and listen to these songs. Get to know the people who made these recordings, the people who recorded them, and the people who performed them, and learn about Florida history and about Florida history during the Depression, to learn about the common people of Florida and what they were listening to, what they cared about. So reading about the songs isn't the same. So thanks to digital preservation efforts of the Library of Congress, now many of the songs can be heard almost 100 years later. And there's about 300 and something songs that are archived online through the Library of Congress website, but they are also physically available at the American Folklife Center in Washington, D.C. I believe only about half of the songs are digitized, but you can go listen to others in person. Maybe someday they'll all be on. So I think of them as primary sources, the songs, as a way that we can explore Florida's cultural history in the 1930s and 40s through the songs of the people. That's a fun way to explore history, right? Through music. And so the audio files, I feel like, allow people to rediscover the song collecting work of the folklorists who made the recordings, and to meet the people who perform the recordings, the songs. I would love to do some genealogy research. I have some names, we can find out what happened to them. Did they move away? Did their life get better after the Depression? There's so many ways to look at these songs and to learn about Florida history. So anyway, I just want to encourage everybody to check out these songs and to learn more about Florida history through music. And thanks for listening.
Well, thanks, Holly. This is a fascinating topic for sure. And I want to point out that you're kind of following in the footsteps of Creta Doggett Course, because almost a century ago, she actually presented at this same event, the Florida Historical Society annual meeting, she gave a presentation on the work that was being done in Florida, collecting these folk songs. And I remember Stetson Kennedy as well, talking about the coffee size table book. And I remember the first time I saw a photograph, I agree, it was not quite that big, but he talked about how it required 3 men to lift it and carry it around. But it is a fascinating that you can go listen to the recordings today through the digitized versions with the Library of Congress. You mentioned Zora Neale Hurston, of course. She wasn't really supposed to be collecting part of that program though, right? Because she was already a successful writer, and that wasn't the purpose of this project, was it?
No, but I have to admit she was having financial issues during that time, and I found it intriguing that she actually didn't talk very often about working for the Federal Writers Project, because I think that in a way, knowing that she was doing a government program maybe was embarrassing to her a little bit, because she needed the money, she needed the work at that time. But yeah, like you say, she already was a well-known writer at that point. But the Depression was a tough time, and a lot of people who were successful writers and historians and whatnot had to do this to make money. But I mean, apparently it really inspired a lot of her writing in the future after that as well.
Well, Levi and Myles, I know both of you are interested in music. Do you have any questions for Holly?
I was just wondering if any particular song stood out to you when you're listening through them, and sort of if there's any that you could share about.
Gosh, there were so many of them, and it's interesting. I was asked this question not that long ago by some folks at a presentation that I did, and my mind started trying to think about 10 different songs. I thought about doing some sort of a project where I could somehow map what the songs were about. I love the songs about there were a lot of songs about going home, about missing people, about wanting to return home. So it seemed like a lot of people were displaced and wanted to go home. Those are the topics that I remember the most. Of course, I like Zora's songs. I like the songs that she sang. She recreated the spiking songs and explained, very detailed what the spiking songs were. I like the juke songs that she found. She liked what she would call baldy songs that proper ladies didn't hear very often. So she enjoyed collecting songs that from juke joints where folks would be like, okay, I shouldn't be telling you this, but here, check this song out. And so I like those kind of songs that she wasn't supposed to be hearing as a proper lady of that time. But yeah, I love fiddle songs, so I quite like the Sebring songs that they found. Anything with a fiddle or a banjo, I'm quite a fan of. But yeah, there's all kinds of good songs to listen to, and like I say, in varying, some of them are in good quality, some of them are kind of scratchy, so that's a shame sometimes. But the fact that they even still exist at all, even if not in not in great shape, you can still hear, and you can hear the foot stomping. I like that too. They're recorded sometimes outside, or on somebody's wooden porch, and you can hear the chickens and the dogs barking and stuff like that, which I really love.
Hey, Holly, I just had a bit of a technical question about the recorder. You said they were aluminum discs that were covered in nitrocellulose lacquer. And was that lacquer then like scratched off during the recording process to make grooves, or?
Wow. Okay. So that is a question that I cannot answer. But I'm intrigued by it because, like I said, I just found out, I contacted the American Folklife Center about a month and a half ago and found out the exact model, but I have yet to see what the disc actually looked like. So I think we'd have to go to the American Folklife Center in person, which I would love to do. And hey, I invite you, let's go,
Right.
and go and see what they look like in person, because I'm curious as well. Did it look like a tiny little record, with little grooves in it? I'm not sure. Maybe I can procure one for our library and when we can check it out.
I'd be interested to know.
All right, well, thanks, Holly. Very interesting, and I don't know either. We'll have to investigate that and find out what that looks like. Next up is Levi Watson, and Levi is a public history MA student at the University of Central Florida. He also did his undergraduate work at UCF, majoring in history with minors in journalism and Florida studies. And Levi also worked at the historic Rossiter House Museum and Gardens in Eau Gallie. His research focuses on the intersection of history and climate change and how a changing climate is affecting coastal cultural heritage sites now and what those effects will look like in the future. So Levi, please tell us about your research into Florida's vanishing heritage, climate adaptation at Florida heritage sites.
All right, thank you, Ben. I'm glad to be here. The impact of climate change is being felt in diverse regions across the world, but that's particularly so for coastal areas. And efforts to mitigate the effects have been undertaken with more or less success across the globe, but the current efforts that are being made now will not be sufficient to be able to avoid like a pretty significant rise in global average temperature by the end of the century. In September, the UN released an updated report on the nationally determined contributions of the 191 countries that have signed the Paris Climate Agreement. And the new report includes updates from the 113 countries that represent roughly 49% of global emissions, which includes the European Union and the United States. Based on the current report, if these countries can meet the goals that they've laid out in their updated NDCs, then there's a potential for roughly like a 26% reduction in global emissions by 2030 when compared to 2010. But a lot of the plans that have been submitted have been criticized as too costly and too ambitious. If the 191 countries in that have signed the Paris Climate Agreement continue on with national plans that are as they are now, and they're unable to meet those ambitious goals that they've laid out, then according to the UN, it's likely that global emissions will actually increase by roughly 16% by 2030 when compared to 2010, which puts the planet on track for roughly 2.7 degrees Celsius or about 4.9 degrees Fahrenheit of warming by the end of the century. This is a significant increase over 21st century, over the previous 21st century warming predictions. And for coastal cities, these predictions are dire. The process of oceanic heat uptake and thermal expansions of the ocean is a slow one. And even if every country on the planet now stopped producing greenhouse gases, seas would continue to rise for perhaps as much as the next century. So the mitigation efforts that are laid out by these countries in the Paris Climate Agreement are crucially important for curbing the impact of climate change in the future. But for many coastal cities, the window for mitigation has come and gone now, and now is the time for adaptation. Around the world, climate change is affecting cultural heritage sites negatively in a multitude of ways, and these are only going to worsen over the coming century. In cold climates, cultural heritage sites are dealing with new or worsening freeze-thaw cracking as water makes its way behind bricks and in the small cracks of mortar. And then also thawing permafrost, which can upset the foundations of buildings that have been built kind of expecting that permafrost to be there. In more arid climates, drought and extreme heat have a lot of negative impacts on wood structures. And then also cultural landscapes are threatened by things like wildfire, which we can see going on now and on the West Coast. But coastal areas are very susceptible to sea level rise, coastal erosion, and also increased storm surge, as we have an increase in both the frequency and intensity of tropical storms. So our shared culture is like one of the things that bond us together, and these customs and traditions and the values that we pass down kind of help us construct our own identities. And examples of tangible cultural resources like buildings and monuments in the built environment and cultural landscapes in the natural environment are kind of the basis for how we relate to our surroundings, and we tie our own cultural identity to the land around us. For historic preservationists and cultural resource managers, climate change presents a challenge of adaptation, not only in the physical sense at heritage sites, but also a challenge in adapting their thinking to what preservation of a site might mean moving forward, which might not necessarily be a physical preservation of the site. So some of the future of some of these sites seems uncertain, but there's kind of a growing recognition in the field that of what it's going to take to kind of help ensure resiliency at these sites. Site managers and preservationists and planners at the local, state, and federal levels are starting to realize that a solid understanding of climate science and the options for mitigation and adaptation strategies, along with an understanding of how to communicate that information to the public and to other stakeholders, is going to be essential for ensuring the future of these threatened sites. So right now in my current research, I'm taking a look at Fort Clinch, which is located in Fort Clinch State Park on Amelia Island, and then also the Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse, located in Jupiter, Florida, right on the Loxahatchee River and the Indian River Lagoon, where they go out to the Atlantic. Both of these coastal cultural heritage sites are located on Florida's Atlantic coast, but they both have a unique set of challenges when responding to climate change. Construction began on Fort Clinch on the northern end of Amelia Island there in 1847, and the fort was intended to protect the entrance to Cumberland Sound. This was part of the third system fortifications of forts that were built on the East Coast after the War of 1812. But construction on the fort was slow, so by the time Florida joined the Confederacy at the outbreak of the Civil War, the fort was still only partially completed. And although Confederate troops did establish batteries on the island or in the area of the fort, this was really short-lived. And by 1862, with the arrival of Union troops, the fort was abandoned and really stayed abandoned until 1935, except for like a one-year period when it was reactivated during the Spanish-American War. So it wasn't until the 30s when the fort was sold, and then the Civilian Conservation Corps began restoration on the fort in early 1936. And then the fort served as a communication and surveillance outpost during World War II, and then was opened to the public and has been available for tours since then. And it was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1972. And today, visitors can go there and tour the fort, interpreted as a Civil War era construction. But being located right on the end of Amelia Island, kind of looking out at the Atlantic and the St. Mary's River, the section of coastline that Fort Clinch sits on is a highly dynamic section, and it's always changing. The natural progression of dune migration on the coast carries sand kind of away from the fort and deposits it into the St. Mary's River. And because this has a a potential to block the entrance to the Kings Bay Naval Base in Georgia, this area has been repeatedly dredged over the decades. And oftentimes, at least a portion of that sand that's dredged is redeposited on the shoreline around Fort Clinch in kind of a shoreline resiliency effort. And that's been going on pretty continuously since the 1940s. But despite this, the shoreline has changed rapidly in the last decades. And this continued erosion, which is already a problem for the fort, is only going to be exacerbated by sea level rise and increased erosion activity in the throughout the rest of the century. Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse is located in Palm Beach County on Florida's Atlantic coast, and the city of Jupiter is the northernmost community in the Miami metropolitan area. So the red brick lighthouse was constructed between 1859 and 1860, and then first lit in July of 1860. But the following year, Confederate sympathizers in the area, they ran the lighthouse keeper off and disabled the light, and it stayed dark until it was relit in 1866, and then it's still operational today. In its tenure, the lighthouse served as a weather station, a signal station, and a radio station for various branches of the armed services. And the lighthouse itself features a first order Fresnel lens, which is one of only 13 that are still operational in the United States. In 1973, the lighthouse was placed on the National Register of Historic Places. And then in 1985, the adjacent archaeological site was also added to the same list. And then in 2008, Congress designated the entire area with the lighthouse and the surrounding 120 acres as a outstanding natural area, which is one of only 10 in the US, and it's the only one that's east of the Mississippi River. The lighthouse facility faces some different challenges when compared to Fort Clinch and in responding to climate change. The lighthouse itself is pretty well positioned to weather the effects of climate change through the coming century, whether it be inundation from sea level rise or coastal erosion, or even increased storm surge. The lighthouse sits on the peak of a natural ridge. And so it's about 40 or 45 feet above sea level. But all the support facilities for the lighthouse, including the administrative offices, the museum, the parking area, and several other structures that were built on the property throughout its life, are all very low-lying and very close to the shore. So while the lighthouse itself is probably pretty protected, the support facilities are very threatened by particularly storm surge and inundation from sea level rise as we move forward. So the National Park Service has laid out 7 possible kind of adaptation strategies for addressing climate change at a particular site. And these range from taking no steps, like no steps towards intervention at sites that have a low level of vulnerability, to working to offset climate stressors and improve resilience and manage the ongoing change at sites that have maybe an average, I would say like an average amount of vulnerability. And at sites that have high levels of vulnerability, the National Park Services, they're looking at either like managed retreat or just documenting the site and preparing for loss. And if the sites are lost, then trying to interpret that change for future visitors to be able to tell them, the changes that have happened to the site because of climate change over the time. So the two kind of main problems in Florida when it comes to garnering support for adaptation projects, really of any kind, let alone for cultural heritage resources, are communication with the public, and then lack of political will to prioritize climate adaptation projects over other projects, other kinds of development projects that have been proposed in a given area. So, and these two problems really go hand in hand. In the state, government leaders at every level need to be better about communicating their understanding of the risks of climate change with their constituents, and also be better about listening to the concerns that the public may have about mitigation or adaptation efforts, and just try to foster this kind of support that large-scale adaptation projects require from the public. But things are beginning to move in that direction. Counties all over the state are following the example of the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact, which consists of Monroe, Miami-Dade, Palm Beach, and Broward counties, who have all come together, and they're working in conjunction with each other to reduce greenhouse gases and then also implement adaptation strategies in the region that are going to help to ensure resiliency for the local populations. Dr. Marcy Rockman, who was formerly the Cultural Resources Adaptation Coordinator for the National Park Service and is now a team leader for the ICOMOS Climate Change and Heritage Working Group, really thinks that this is where threatened cultural heritage resources can kind of play a role in bringing climate change adaptation to the forefront of climate change conversation. Cultural heritage resources like cherished landscapes or buildings that evoke a sense of history or nostalgia can really play on the heartstrings of the public. And there seems to be a trend right now where the public is kind of apathetic about saving cultural heritage resources until something is damaged or lost, and then support for restoration and future protection really starts to kind of pour in. Maybe with better communication and kind of community outreach going forward, maybe site managers and preservationists can kind of turn historical adaptation into this catalyst that gets the public more involved with the conversation around climate change and kind of what we can do to protect our history and our communities moving forward.
Great. Well, thank you. It's wow. This this falls on difficult history and protecting the future. It's of course, there's so much coastline in Florida. Over on the West Coast, we've already seen, prehistoric cemeteries and other indigenous people sites are well underwater into the Gulf of Mexico that used to be on land in Florida, and it's horrible to even think about what could happen at some of these sites. So your work is very important. You also looked at one point at St. Augustine, right? Talk about pulling the heartstrings, the oldest continuously occupied European settlement in Florida, or in the continental United States, certainly. And there's real threats there too, right? Of this effect from climate change.
Yeah, certainly. And St. Augustine has some particularly unique challenges because so much of the history, or so much of the city is historic. It's all spread out. And so in some other places where they can kind of focus on mitigation and adaptation strategies that affect residential areas versus cultural resource heritage, St. Augustine doesn't have that luxury, which is good and bad for them. It certainly puts more cultural heritage sites at risk, but then it also tends to take away some of that apathy because not only are these sites at risk, but also the people that live in the area are dealing with the same risks in their homes, on a daily basis. And so the city is working really hard, and they're doing great work there to adapt to sea level rise, particularly. They were having an issue where sometimes up to 16 times a year, they were having sunny day flooding issues where just like on a king tide, seawater was backing up through the storm drainage systems and flooding the streets. Over the last couple of years, they've installed close to 80 storm drain outfalls that are like one-way check valves in the outfalls that prevent water from backing up through the system. And that's done a lot to kind of curb that sunny day inundation in some historical areas of the city.
Great. Well, Holly and Myles, do you have some questions for Levi?
I just have one more question. You did mention the Jupiter Inlet Lighthouse, Fort Clinch at Amelia Island, and St. Augustine, but what are some other historic sites in Florida that are highly vulnerable to climate change? I don't know if you've looked into it enough, but would you say the west coast of Florida versus the east coast of Florida, is there an area that's more vulnerable than other areas of Florida?
There are some kind of different vulnerabilities from the West Coast and the East Coast. The East Coast has there's like a drop off of the Atlantic shelf, and so pretty quickly it goes to deep water. On the West Coast, the transition from land out to the Gulf is much more gradual, and so as Dr. Brotemarkle mentioned, because of that, a lot of that land, maybe in prehistoric times and early historic times, was dry, livable land where there were buildings and sites that were constructed, and because they were so far away from what is dry land now. So many of those things have been lost, and that's not so much the case on the East Coast because that drop, that kind of shelf was there, and so. But there are vulnerable sites all around the state. On the West Coast, Egmont Key sits right at the mouth of Tampa Bay, and in the mid 1800s, a small fort was built on Egmont, Fort Dade. And then Egmont Key was actually used as a holding site for Seminoles that were captured during the Seminole Wars before they were transported to other states. The island was surveyed by the U.S. Coast Guard. Today, there's a Coast Guard station, a small Coast Guard station on the island, and then the remains of Fort Dade. Because most of the fort has fallen into the ocean by now. When the Coast Guard surveyed the island, I believe in 1875, and then it was again surveyed in the early 2000s, and there was like a 40 to 50% reduction in size of the island just in that time, which is a pretty short time scale. And so now Fort Dade is about half in the ocean. But in other areas where we talk about like cultural landscapes, the Everglades are an important cultural landscape to many of the kind of groups that live in Florida. And the same thing, sea level rise threatens that with changes in salinity, and so changing the kind of the natural flora and fauna that are in the area, but also just losing those, those previously dry hammocks and things like that. And so, yeah, it's definitely an issue that people are looking at all over the state.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have maybe it's hard to answer because it seems like such a big problem, and you don't know where we should put energy in terms of this issue, in terms of resources. Just this last summer, UF and Flagler College, we were doing a field school, archaeological field school at Fort Mose, just north of St. Augustine, precisely because of this issue, that it's slowly getting inundated. And I guess, I don't know if, but how does like efforts towards historic preservation compare with efforts towards maybe, you know, efforts to save the Everglades and stuff like that? Is there a same level of maybe energy, or I guess, where is the most sort of action being taken right now? And if that's changing at all towards heritage, or if it's happening together?
I think they're kind of happening together, which maybe wasn't the case in years past. The Everglades has kind of a long history of activism in its favor, and so there's been for a long time in Florida a push to kind of not only clean up the Everglades of nutrients that have been introduced from like sugar growing lands and things like that, but also to just restore the path of flowing water to a more kind of traditional path in the Everglades. But I think now, and especially in places like St. Augustine and Miami Beach, there's even more emphasis is being put on the cultural heritage side of that, like in the built environment. And so I think we're really starting to see that coming around on both sides.
Well, thanks so much for Myles Sullivan, Holly Baker, and Levi Watson for sharing your fascinating research. It's really been a great session, and I appreciate all of your work. And if anybody watching this does have further questions, you can email us at membership@myfloridahistory.org, and we'll pass along your questions to the presenters and get them answered. And thanks for joining us today.